Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Welcome to In the Word as we continue our study about a new creation and moving toward a new creation. We just concluded a study of the prophet Zephaniah, and we saw there he was looking toward the end. He was looking toward something new one day that God would bring about. And now we're going to move into Romans, where Paul is dealing with the thesis of God bringing a new thing into existence in Jesus Christ. So we'll be in the book of Romans until the end of this quarter. And so it will be different from Zephaniah, will it not, Lee?
It will in some ways, although Paul starts out talking about the sin of God's covenant people and what that sin involved,
yes,
and how God is going to deal with that sin.
And it's not only the sin of his people, but it's universal.
Of all human beings, as it was in Zephaniah. But then we come to the gospel part of the message, the good news of how God dealt with sin, and then the consequences of that in behavior of God's covenant people. So there are actually some parallels here, but we're going to do a good job covering many of the passages in Romans over the rest of this quarter.
The first 3 chapters of Romans are a litany on the subject of sin.
Right.
And really, we can't see the whole picture in one lesson. I think, 3 lessons we have on those 3 chapters. And so we're taking a very complex statement of Paul, the last 3 chapters, and then we're going to break it down into its various parts.
The main point is really fairly simply stated in chapter 3, which is that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But he takes 3 chapters to try to
get there,
to tease that out and explain just what that means.
Well, that's a good choice of language to say he's teasing it out, because I always referred to, when teaching this in Bible survey, that of Paul's most formal letter. It is beautifully constructed and argued. Everything he says is very very classically argued, and it's without a doubt the high water mark, I think, of his theological statement.
It definitely is, and there's a reason for that. Paul doesn't know many of these Christians in Rome. He's never been there, and he didn't found this church, and so he doesn't have a lot of personal problems that he has to deal with, like he does in the Corinthian letters or in Philippians or even in
Well, he doesn't
Galatians.
know the church that well. He says it has a good reputation.
Yeah.
And its reputation is known throughout the world, the world as it was then.
Yeah. So he has the luxury of laying out for them a grand vision of his understanding of human sin and of God's love and of salvation in Jesus Christ. And so that gives him that luxury of having such a beautifully developed theological statement.
It's almost, I sense, though, that he is maybe writing this a little bit in defense of his theological statement. We're not under the law, we're under grace.
Yes, he's writing somewhat defensively here, but it's not because of what people in Rome are saying about him, I don't think, because he really doesn't have all that much direct contact with Rome.
Well, what had he just experienced before writing this letter?
This letter was written from Corinth near the end of the 3rd missionary journey, about AD 56 or so. And what he had experienced earlier on the 3rd journey was revisiting some of the churches in central Turkey Our viewers will remember them from their study of the book of Acts.
Derbe,
places
Lystra.
like Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch of Pisidia. And there were some Christians who had developed a Judaizing tendency, by which we mean...
And Galatians dealt with that, didn't it?
It did, the letter of Galatians. But that still weighs on Paul, that knowing that there were some Christians who were teaching that Gentile converts to Christianity had to first jump through the hoop of Jewish legal obedience in order to be saved.
Almost like they had to become Jews before they could become Christians.
And that offended Paul deeply, as it should have, because he felt like it undermined God's grace, the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, and the kind of broad Christian morality, not just based on obedience to the Mosaic law. And so it undermined so much that was central in Paul's view that he wrote a fairly angry letter back to the Galatians.
I always call that Paul's angriest letter.
It is his angriest letter.
He even leaves out the Thanksgiving section. He wasn't particularly thankful for anything.
Yeah. Now, shortly, a little bit of time has passed, but I think that's still much on his mind. And so when he goes to write this grand theological vision of his to the Romans, some of those issues are still popping up in this letter.
Exactly. The Judaizer problem did not go away.
Right.
It was supposed to have been solved in the conference in Jerusalem about the year 49 or so.
Yeah.
And then they even undertook to send out representatives of that conference to these churches, and it still didn't go away. And then Paul was involved with even Peter, apparently, over this issue, and still it didn't go away.
Yeah.
And so it was, in Colossians even, is still dealing when he writes that letter.
That's well after this letter. So he doesn't have the anger or the passion of Galatians in this letter, but he does still deal with some of those topics. Yeah.
It's still on, as you say, and I think correctly so, it's still on his mind.
It is, yeah. Now the theme verses of this whole letter are found right before the printed text, and I'd like to make reference to them.
Isn't it a shame that they didn't get into the printed
text? It's a long text, and I'm going to be reading it in just a second, but I do want to point our viewers to verses 16 and 17, which precede this, in which Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel," the good news. "It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith." Notice he doesn't say to everyone who is circumcised or to everyone who keeps the law of Moses. To everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And there you can see some of these problems with the Judaizers emerging. What is it that's the basis of our salvation?
Can we put Jews and Greeks together in the same church?
Yes, and who is salvation for? Is it just for the Jews, or is it also for Gentiles?
Right.
In it,
that's in the gospel?
In the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, and here he quotes from the little Old Testament book of Habakkuk.
2:4.
The one who is righteous will live by faith. Well, those are the ideas that lie in the background of this letter and are kind of emerging all the way through it.
Just a brief comment about how the letter begins in a very formal way. Paul, a slave of...
Right.
But an apostle.
But called to be an apostle.
And he is in the work of preaching the gospel of Christ. So, and he is thankful for what he hears about them and their commitment to Jesus Christ. And that leads him up to this thesis statement that the gospel is the power. And I guess that's dunamis.
It is.
Dynamite.
And he makes very clear in those opening verses that you're referring to that the gospel isn't just some generic good news. It's a good news based on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it's the gospel of Christ.
It is.
And so then the very next thing after verses 16 and 17 is our text that we have in the printed text for us today. It's very long.
It is.
And I'm glad you get to read
Okay.
it. I'll rest while you're reading.
And this is where Paul begins his explanation of what was the need that brought on this saving work of God in Jesus
It's going to take him 3 chapters.
Yep.
So what we're going to do is kind of dissect out the various parts of his thinking here and the line of thought that he is using.
All right. Well, I'll start reading at chapter 1, verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people, who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds, and animals, and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They've become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them.
End of chapter 1.
Yes.
We got 2 chapters left to go.
Okay.
to get through the whole line of thought.
Now this section starts with a reference to the wrath of God, and I think we need to think about this.
Yes.
I know that one of the most famous sermons in the history of American preaching is "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God."
Jonathan
Edwards. Yeah, from early in our country's history. I want to comment on the word wrath because some people might misunderstand this as if
He's
God,
throwing a tantrum?
Yes, if God is just getting ticked off at human sin and just goes off, flies off the handle. That is not the way Paul views the anger of God.
No.
There are 2 very distinct words here. One Greek word does refer to a tantrum kind of anger, kind of a sudden burst of
an outburst of fury.
Of fury. That's a good way to put it. This word is a very different word, and so it's translated wrath, not anger, because this involves a more settled, rational anger of God against a constant, repeated rejection of His will.
It's less emotional, base emotional, and more rational. And we see that Paul is really going to proceed himself in a very rational definition and explanation.
Yeah.
And he is saying this is how God views the state of the world.
Yeah. Now Paul makes an extravagant claim here. He says that everybody has been able to see and sense the presence of God in the universe. Even Gentiles. You know, you would expect him to say, well, Jews know God exists because Jews have the revelation of the Old Testament.
Yes.
And they have the prophets. But
right.
Those Gentiles didn't really know God, so we can excuse them. No, he says, no, creation was their Bible.
Well, when you study the Greek philosophers, you find a very intense study of nature and an attempt to explain where it came from and why does it function the way it does, in an attempt to boil down to some primitive single purpose or explanation of all that exists. So Paul was very aware of the Greek philosophers. Now, even lying behind the Greek philosophers were the rather mythological explanations, but they are explanations nonetheless.
That's true.
Of where the world came from and why is it that tragedy happens in the world and so forth. So, but as the Greeks got a hold of these concepts, they even pushed them further in trying to explain. So Paul is right on target. He is saying that even pagan people who have no knowledge of the God of the Old Testament at all have been dealing with these same issues.
They have a sense of God in the universe in one way or another. He says in verse 20 that there are two basic qualities of God that everybody should have gotten, that should have sensed.
Yes.
First is the power of God. And there's that word dunamis that you referred to before. By the way, dunamis is a favorite word of Paul's in Romans because Rome, of course, was the center of the Roman Empire.
Dunamis.
And they really
they knew how to use dunamis.
They knew power.
Yeah,
they knew power.
Yeah.
And so he, in trying to appeal to the Roman mind, he uses that word a lot. So the first thing is everybody, just looking at creation, at waterfalls, at whatever, at the ocean, at storms.
The regularity of the heavens.
Yeah. Should have been able to sense the power of God. And then the second thing he says is that they should have been able to sense a kind of deity at work. And you were just talking about this. Even the philosophers who didn't so much buy into the myths of Zeus and all the other gods and goddesses.
They were moving away from a God-centered system that explains the universe.
Right, but even they seemed to realize that there was some prime mover behind all of this, a divine fire at the center of the universe. They described it in different ways. So Paul says everybody should have been able to understand that there is a deity and that deity is very powerful. But he goes on to say that even though they had this sense or this experience of deity, they didn't really honor God. They didn't worship God. They didn't give thanks to God. They claimed to be wise. We know how much Jews, Greeks especially, valued wisdom.
Yes.
But they didn't really act in a wise way by rejecting
In attempting
God.
to describe this deity, they turned to creepy, crawly things, snakes, lizards, and all kinds of spirits, demigods, and all the rest. And in thereby lowering their estimation of how God is to be understood, this deity. They have sunk to a situation where it is creating the gods in the image of man and creatures rather than the other way around.
In a way, what they did is exchange worship of the Creator for worship of creation.
You're right.
Because these gods and goddesses represented various aspects of creation. When they're worshiping Zeus, they're worshiping the power of the sky.
Yes.
When they're worshiping Apollo, they're worshiping the power of the sun. When they're worshiping Poseidon, they're worshiping the power of the sea.
Yes.
Well, these
and
are
Hades, the power of the netherworld.
Right. So these are all creations of God, and instead of viewing the creation as a window that allowed them to see the deity more clearly, they focused on the window and saw and made it their deity.
You especially see this in Paul's sermon on Mars Hill at the Areopagus, where he says, you're worshiping a thing that you call the unknown God. Now I'm here to tell you about this one unknown God that is supreme and subsumes all of the other gods.
Right. And this is the first tragic exchange that Paul accuses them of making. He uses that word in verse 23. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like human beings, birds, reptiles, whatever.
Right.
Aspects of creation. So this is a tragic exchange, and that's the word he uses for that.
It seems that in the Old Testament prophets, it is very clear that all sin comes from one original sin, and the original sin is idolatry.
Failing to acknowledge God.
That's buried and implicit in the prophets of the Old Testament, and now Paul is just simply flat out saying that.
He uses the word images there in verse 23.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be a graven image, but if we worship anything other than God, if we worship the creation rather than the Creator, that's a form of idolatry.
Precisely.
Now the second great exchange isn't so much their acknowledgement of God, their worship of God, it has to do with their moral lives. And that comes in verses 24, 25, and following. God gave them over to the desires of their hearts. And
what does this mean? Because this "gave them over" occurs, I think, 3 times in these verses. What does this mean? What is the use of this term, to give over?
Yeah, it's actually it's actually the word that's used for betrayal at times. They handed over Jesus. You know how Judas handed over Jesus? It's that word. And so they kind of, God just handed them over and said, okay, this is what you've chosen.
Now
live with the consequences.
You're going to have to live with it.
Live with the consequences.
So it's actually allowing, or actually saying, this is where this mistake that you're making about the nature of God leads you.
Right.
And it's inescapable.
Yeah. So the first exchange they made was exchanging the glory of God for images, created things. The second one, according to verse 25, is they exchanged the truth about God and His expectations for our lives with a lie. And this leads to immorality, impurity. One example of which he picks up here, and that is sexual.
Yes.
But that's certainly not the only kind of impurity.
Oh, when he gets through with his list that's coming up in the last of these verses, you can see it's a big, long list.
Right. Let me comment on verse 24 for a second. It says God gave them over to sinful desires of their heart. The word sinful isn't actually there. And I think that's important. It's not just our sinful desires that get us into trouble. It's our desires.
Yeah.
And there's nothing inherently sinful about our desires. The desire for food is not sinful. The desire for drink is not sinful. The desire for rest is not sinful. The desire for sex is not sinful.
Right.
It's a command by God.
And sexual isn't in the text either.
The word sexual isn't even there. The problem is if we allow our desires to determine our decisions in life, we will be led in one probably destructive path rather than allowing the deity to guide the decisions of our lives.
This immediately takes me back to the 10th of the 10 Commandments. Coveting is not a separate word. It's just simply the word desire.
Okay.
In other words, your desires can get out of control.
That's it. It's not that the desires are inherently evil. It's that if we just follow our desires, they can get out of control. I'll tell you who else makes this point so powerfully. It's the little letter of James.
Exactly.
He talks about how desire can lead to sin. And it's not just sinful desires. Well, I just wanted to reiterate that point.
We just barely gotten started into this text, and we don't have very much time left. So how would you like to spend the time? In the end of the statement, look at this catalog. Paul is big on catalogs of things.
And he has several lists of sins in his writings, Romans, Galatians.
This is the biggest one.
This is the longest one.
Yeah.
And none of his lists are checklists of every Christian sin. They're always just examples.
Right.
But this one has a lot of examples. And
a lot of them have to do with mental attitudes.
A lot of them have to do with attitude. Some of them have to do with interpersonal relationships.
Yes.
But
and some outward acts.
Yes. He concludes in verse 31 with our relationship with God, though, where he's talking about understanding of God, I think he means, faithfulness, fidelity toward God, love toward God, and then
is that agape?
Sharing God's word. No, it's one of the rarest words for love. It's storge.
Storge.
And yes, it's one of the most
It's
unusual
not phileo
words.
and it's not agapao.
And it's not eros. It's storge, which is a kind of interpersonal love, a family love. So
love within the family.
Within the family. So thinking of God as a loving parent, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Well, there are two overarching points here. That is that sin, of which we are all subject, involves a rejection of what we know about God, and it involves a following human desires into sin apart from God's guidance. And
that's where the mess comes from.
Yes, and all of us are subject to that.
Yes.
Jews were, so were Gentiles.
Right. And we're going to continue with two other lessons from the remaining two chapters, and we're going to see where he goes with this.
Yeah.
And he is going to be comparing Jews with non-Jews, and he finds really they both have their failings, but of different kinds.
We're left with three options, really. Are we going to worship ourselves and our own desires? Are we going to worship creation, the natural world around us? Or are we going to worship God who created us all?
Yes. Well, I'm sure you folks, you know where we stand on this, that actually with Paul saying that we have to focus on God to begin with as we build our lives. Well, we have two more lessons to deal with this particular part of Romans, and we trust you'll come back and be with us. And we wish you a happy week in the Lord Jesus Christ.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.